This story is based on real archaeological evidence and oral histories. Some scenes may be disturbing to sensitive viewers. What you're about to see is not just prehistoric fiction. It's what may have actually happened when our ancestors faced the sea. Viewer discretion is advised.
Picture this. You're squatting on a sun-baked beach 12,000 years ago. Your hands are sticky with fish guts, your fire is almost out, and the morning mist hasn't yet burned off the horizon. Your tribe is quiet today, tired, peaceful, and then the ocean disappears. One moment it's there, shimmering, endless, lapping at your toes. The next, it's gone, pulled backward like the earth just inhaled. The seabirds go silent. The crabs freeze. Your cousin stares at the vanishing tide, confused. Then someone whispers, "The ocean is running away." But that's not it. The ocean isn't running. It's winding up. Forget Hollywood's crashing waves and palm tree nonsense. The real threat of a tsunami begins with silence, with confusion. And for ancient humans, it began with a test of instinct versus extinction. Because here's what no one tells you. Surviving a tsunami wasn't just about strength, speed, or shelter. It was about memory. It was about myth. It was about whether your ancestors knew the signs, or whether they died learning them. And some of them did learn. Because against all odds, we have the evidence. Buried in caves, scattered in sediment, etched into stone proof that prehistoric humans not only witnessed tsunamis, but adapted to them. And what they did in those final moments, what they passed down through smoke and story, might be the reason you're here right now. Today, you'll learn how a single rogue wave 12,000 years ago triggered the first inland migration of entire tribes, why a prehistoric cave in Indonesia contains human footprints running from the ocean, frozen in volcanic mud, how ancient tsunami survivors used driftwood and sea stone to build high-ground camps designed to collapse in waves, yes, designed to break, and the haunting theory that some tribes began sacrificing coastal caves, sealing them off like tombs to appease the ocean. But this isn't just ancient history. Today, as rising sea levels threaten global coastlines, and megathrust earthquakes loom off fault lines like ticking clocks, the strategies used by our ancient ancestors are starting to look a lot less primitive and a lot more essential. Because, here's the twist. While most species were wiped out in prehistoric tsunamis, humans didn't just survive. They learned. They studied the ocean like it was alive. They memorized which birds fled first. They watched how turtles behaved before the water receded. They drew lines in sand where the wave had reached once. And in places like Lambata, Japan, and Papua New Guinea, those stories still survive. Stories so old, they predate writing. But they may have saved more lives than any evacuation map ever printed. So settle in. Because you're about to enter a world where the beach was bait, the sky was quiet, and the ocean could vanish without warning. Where prehistoric humans turned coastlines into war zones and learned through tragedy that the sea could not be trusted. This is the forgotten story of humanity's first fight against the ocean. This is what cavemen did when there was a tsunami. You don't hear the wave before it hits. You feel it. The earth shivers, not violently, just enough to make the dry grass rustle like it's whispering a warning. Your cousin stands, confused, still watching the empty shoreline. You call out something primal, something like, "Back." But it's too late, because the wave isn't a wave anymore. It's a wall, and it's not made of water. It's made of force. This is the part of every tsunami story where modern humans imagine drama surfers outrunning waves, boats tossed like toys. But for your ancestors, there were no cameras, no escape routes, No breaking news, only instinct. And what we found deep in the prehistoric record tells us some of those instincts kicked in just in time. Loy Liang, Indonesia. In 2007, archaeologists uncovered something strange in a limestone cave near the coast. Human footprints, but not random ones. They were staggered, clustered, angled sharply inland. The sediment showed panic, slipping, sprinting, tiny feet beside large ones, children with adults. Some prints were smeared mid-fall, others just stopped. The people didn't walk away, they ran. Some didn't make it. And just above the layer of footprints, a fine sheet of marine clay, salt-rich, high in shell fragments. The unmistakable fingerprint of a massive wave that roared inland and turned the beach into a grave. But here's what's eerie. The footprints were not straight lines. They zigzagged, clustered. Some circled back as if trying to warn others. This wasn't just escape. This was rescue. What does that mean? It means even 12,000 years ago, humans had response systems. Not sirens, not drills, but roles. The fast pulled the slow. The strong carried the weak. They had minutes, maybe seconds, but they acted together, and that's not the only clue. In the South Pacific, there's a legend passed down by the indigenous Ada people of the Philippines. They call it the sea that eats. According to oral history, their ancestors knew that when the sea fled, it would soon come back angry. They memorized the shape of the shoreline, taught their children. If the water leaves without asking, do not stay to say goodbye. Modern researchers now believe those stories told around fires for over 0 years were born from a real tsunami. A wave so devastating it burned itself into myth. And those myths? They saved lives in 2004 when the Indian Ocean tsunami struck. Villagers who remembered the old stories ran for the hills. Others who waited didn't. So what did cavemen do when the ocean vanished? They didn't just scream. They didn't just scatter. They remembered. They followed stories passed down by firelight. They watched the sky, the birds, the sudden stillness. They acted before it was too late. But what happened after the wave? When the world stopped moving and the water drained away, what did survivors come back to? What did they build? Where did they go? And how did they prepare for the next time? Because there was a next time. And the answers lie buried in driftwood shelters, upside-down trees, and ghost villages made of broken coral and bone. You return to your beach. But it's not a beach anymore. It's a wasteland. The trees are broken at the base, snapped like stalks. The fire pit is gone. So is your neighbor's shelter. And where the tide once danced gently over smooth sand, there's now a crust of salt and debris, and silence. Nothing chirps, nothing hums. Even the wind holds its breath. Here's what modern archaeology often forgets to ask. What did survivors do next? Because survival isn't just not dying, it's knowing how to start again. And what we found in prehistoric coastlines across the world from Southeast Asia to the Mediterranean is evidence that ancient humans didn't just escape tsunamis. They learned from them, adapted to them, and, in some cases, anticipated them. Andaman Islands, Indian Ocean. In 2004, after one of the deadliest tsunamis in recorded history, researchers went looking for survivors. Not in hospitals, not in cities, in the forests. Because one group, the Jarawa, a tribal people descended from prehistoric humans, suffered 0 deaths. Why? Because they knew. Before the shaking started, they noticed the birds had gone quiet. The dogs began howling. The ocean made a sound it wasn't supposed to make, a low, sucking hiss. And without hesitation, the Jarawa ran inland. Not randomly. They had routes, designated high grounds. They had no written language, but they had something more powerful. Memory turned into action. And if they remembered, their prehistoric ancestors must have too. Across ancient coastlines, archaeologists have found driftwood shelters built miles inland, far beyond any daily use for water. These weren't fishing camps, they weren't seasonal homes, they were fallback zones, emergency outposts. Rudimentary, yes, but deliberate. Their construction shows something rare. Flat stone floors to stay above flood mud smoke. Blackened ceilings from long-term fires and char patterns on outer walls, suggesting they were designed to burn or collapse when abandoned. Why build shelters meant to fail? Because the lesson was simple. You don't rebuild where the wave might return. You sacrifice the shoreline. In parts of ancient Japan, early Jomon settlements built what we now call tsunami markers. Large rocks placed where the highest waterline had once reached. They called these places the line where the gods came angry. No one built below it. For generations, and even in places without stone or ceremony, the memory remained, carved into which caves were abandoned, which animals were avoided, which trees were never cut. Because in the ancient world, sometimes the only early warning system you had was your own fear passed forward. But here's where it gets truly strange. In a cave system off the coast of what's now Malaysia, researchers found dozens of human-made drums carved into hollowed logs. They were placed in a half circle facing the water and carbon dated to roughly 9,000 years ago. Why? The theory. When the water started to recede, people would beat the drums, not just to signal escape, but to warn others miles away. A prehistoric acoustic alarm system. Birds can fly, animals can run, but humans? We signal, we remember, we plan. So what did cavemen do when the tsunami ended? They mourned, they marked, and then they engineered memory into everything they touched. They built with loss in mind. They passed down danger and story. They stopped trusting the sea, because one thing was certain, the wave would come back, and they would have to be ready before it did. You don't remember when the stories started, only that they came with the smell of salt, told in whispers around dying fires, stories about the villages below the sea, places your ancestors once lived, now silent, drowned, forbidden. And though no one dared swim there, they all agreed on one thing. It was better that way. Today we call these places submerged prehistoric settlements, but to ancient people, they were more than ruins. They were warnings. And what we're discovering beneath the sea is rewriting what we thought we knew about early humans and what they were truly capable of. Doggerland, the lost world of Europe. Between modern-day England and the Netherlands, archaeologists uncovered something stunning beneath the North Sea. An entire landscape, rivers, forests, animal bones, and human tools, thousands of them. For years, it was dismissed as coincidence, washed-up debris. But now, scientists agree. This was a real human homeland, 8,000 years ago. A place of hunting camps, seasonal migrations, and permanent settlements, all erased by a tsunami so massive, its waves reached over 40 meters high. The Storegga Slide, an underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, triggered one of the most catastrophic events in prehistoric European history, and it happened fast. The sea didn't creep, it devoured. Entire valleys were erased, campsites gone. The people either adapted or vanished. But here's what no one expected. At the edges of Doggerland, the parts that stayed above water, longer archaeologists found tools deliberately buried in tight clusters, packed beneath rocks and driftwood. Not just tossed, hidden. Why? One theory. intentional abandonment. Another, darker one, ritual drowning. Could prehistoric people have flooded their own settlements? On purpose? Bimini Road, the Caribbean mystery. Off the coast of the Bahamas lies a strange structure. Long rows of rectangular limestone blocks, now lying under shallow turquoise water. Some claim it's natural. Others say prehistoric humans built it. It's not just the shape that's strange, it's the location. If this was a land bridge or coastal settlement, it would have required sophisticated maritime knowledge. And here's the twist. Nearby caves contain artifacts of people who lived inland, yet consistently carved symbols of waves, drowning, and the sea taking memory. Were these the same people who built Bimini Road? Did they witness a flood so traumatic they memorialized it in stone? Or did they intentionally construct barriers trying to hold the ocean back? Pavlo-Petri, Greece, the oldest underwater city. This one is real. Confirmed. At over 5,000 years old, Pavlo-Petri is the oldest known underwater urban settlement on Earth, laid out with streets, rooms, even plumbing. But here's what makes it chilling. There are no signs of violence, no signs of disaster, only disappearance. The entire city seems to have been peacefully evacuated. Tools left behind. Fires put out. Structures intact. Some researchers now believe the inhabitants saw the sea rising slowly, day by day, and chose to abandon the city entirely, leaving it to the ocean like a gift or a grave. Not panic, decision. A message carved in absence. We were here. We knew. We left. And that brings us back to your ancestors, because maybe the scariest truth of all isn't the chaos of a tsunami. Maybe it's that some early humans learned to see it coming and quietly prepared for their world to vanish. They buried their tools. They sealed off sacred caves. They walked away from homes they'd built for generations. And they told no one. Because back then, knowing what the ocean could do was a kind of sacred knowledge. And the more you knew, the less you trusted the tide. Before the ground trembled, before the tide disappeared, before a single human voice cried out in fear, the animals were already gone. The dogs stopped barking, the birds fell silent, and in the deepest part of the forest, even the insects paused like the whole world was holding its breath. Your ancestors noticed, and the ones who listened lived. Modern science tells us that animals are often the first to detect disasters. But what we're only now beginning to understand is this. Prehistoric humans didn't just observe that behavior. They relied on it. Tsunami dogs, a timeless bond. In nearly every tsunami-surviving tribal culture, from the Ada of the Philippines to the Andamanese Islanders, there are stories of dogs acting strange before the wave, pacing, whining, dragging children away from the shore. In one oral legend, a dog named Kari reportedly bit through the ropes tying its owner's canoe, forcing him to abandon the coast just minutes before it was swallowed whole. Archaeologists studying ancient burial sites in coastal caves have found something remarkable. Human and dog skeletons buried together, with the dog's remains facing outward. Toward the cave entrance, positioned like a watchdog even in death, these weren't pets. They were guardians. One site in prehistoric Taiwan even shows early domesticated dogs kept in coastal camps, but only when seasonal storms were expected. Coincidence? Or did humans keep dogs as a kind of living alarm system that told the future long before radar, before seismographs, before weather reports? Birds were the first data scientists. In Indonesia, coastal tribes knew that when the sea swallows the crabs, but the gulls refused to land, danger was coming. In Melanesia, they told children to watch the herons if they flew inland in spiral patterns. It meant the sea was about to rise. But here's what connects this to prehistory. In a cave wall on the Andaman coast, dated to over 9,000 years ago, archaeologists discovered a crude but unmistakable carving. A man with a spear, a rising wave behind him, and above, a single bird in flight. No words, just symbolism. This wasn't art, it was a warning. The tsunami feather ritual. Among the coastal Maori of New Zealand, a legend tells of a tribe that tied bird feathers to sticks planted near their camps. When the feathers trembled without wind, they packed and moved. Recent studies of traditional tsunami markers suggest some were not stones, but animal totems, carved birds or wolves placed at key locations, marking the safe line. In other words, animals were the map, and prehistoric humans knew how to read them. The elephants and the flood. One of the most famous modern examples comes from the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. In Sri Lanka, elephants at a wildlife preserve broke their chains and fled to higher ground hours before the wave hit. No training, no command, just instinct. Why does this matter? Because cave paintings in ancient India depict elephants near cliff faces, next to symbols of rising water and human figures watching. Some believe this was a memory, passed on visually, of how elephants led humans to safety. Is it possible cavemen learned to follow the animals that refused to stay behind? But here's where it gets even stranger. In a series of submerged stone circles off the coast of Micronesia, researchers found carvings of birds, dogs, and turtles all facing inland, not randomly, deliberately aligned. Some believe these were warning stones, placed to remind future generations, when they go, you go. So what did cavemen do when there was a tsunami? Sometimes, nothing, because they didn't have to do anything. If they watched and waited and trusted the creatures who'd survived long before us, they ran at the right moment. They avoided the first wave. They lived, because in a world with no sirens, no phones, no broadcasts, instinct was the loudest voice. And it often came on 4 legs, or 2 wings. At first glance, the new shelters look like mistakes. Roofs made of woven reeds, walls that lean barely tied together, floors, none. You step into one after the Great Flood, it creaks, the wind whistles through, it feels unsafe. But that's exactly the point, because after the wave, your ancestors realized something chilling. The stronger your home, the harder it is to leave. And in a tsunami, staying put is a death sentence. So what did they do? They started building structures designed to fall. Shelters meant to scare you into fleeing. Villages engineered to say, you are not safe here. But on what? Thailand. On a high plateau in northern Thailand, archaeologists uncovered a strange prehistoric settlement. No permanent hearths, no heavy walls, but plenty of signs that people had lived there repeatedly and briefly. The materials used? Palm leaf walls that disintegrate in weeks, stilted bamboo frames that sway in strong winds, and woven reed mats instead of floors. But what blew researchers away was this. The settlement was built after a known tsunami layer, a clear band of marine sediment found across the floodplain below, which means they didn't just move to higher ground. They learned how to live temporarily, to treat home not as a fortress, but as a warning. Why build something that breaks? Because when danger is slow, you forget. You settle. You get comfortable. You think maybe the ocean's done with you. But your ancestors knew better, so they built homes that never let them forget. La Libertad del Salvador Coastal farmers found a cluster of strange stone patterns on a hill overlooking the sea, eventually identified as ancient shelter foundations dated over 6,000 years ago. But here's what's odd. The stones were arranged in loose spirals, not squares or circles. There were no structural reinforcements, no signs they tried to keep the homes from falling apart. When researchers dug deeper, they found drainage channels running from the shelters toward the edge of the cliff, as if the homes were designed to funnel water away from people. This wasn't just survival. This was architecture for retreat, the dry camp theory. Some scholars now believe prehistoric survivors created two types of villages: wet camps near rivers, beaches, or lakes, used seasonally for food, fishing, and trade dry camps inland, sparse, elevated, and always ready. And here's the genius. Dry camps were built with no emotional weight. No paint, no art, no graves, no long-term storage. That way, no one got attached. If the wave came, or even if the birds stopped chirping, they'd leave. No questions, no delays, just go. These weren't just shelters. They were exit strategies in disguise. Tsunami memory markers. Not just rocks. In Indonesia and Japan, we find boulders carved with simple messages: do not build below this point. But in older coastal communities, long before writing, the villages themselves were the markers. The ruins you passed on your way down to the sea, the half-buried huts with no roofs, they weren't forgotten. They were deliberately left as warnings, like ghost towns etched into the hillside, whispering, "We lived here once. Then the sea took it. Don't be next." And here's what will send chills down your spine. In a region of the Andaman Islands, archaeologists found the remains of a prehistoric watchtower. It wasn't tall, maybe 12 feet, but inside they found ash from repeated fires, charcoal writing in geometric patterns, and one perfectly preserved shell horn placed facing east toward the sea. A lookout, a siren, a signal fire, a prehistoric tsunami alert station. So what did cavemen do after the wave? They didn't build stronger. They built smarter. They engineered fear into their homes. They turned their shelters into reminders, not of what was lost, but of what would absolutely come again. They sealed it for a reason. The entrance was covered in stacked stones. No obvious path, no airflow, no light. But when modern archaeologists finally unsealed the cave, deep in a coastal bluff overlooking the Pacific, what they found changed everything. At first, dust, then charcoal marks, then something ancient and unmistakable, a handprint, massive, elongated, etched into the rock with red ochre. The fingers curled slightly, almost like they were reaching, and they pointed in one clear direction, toward the ocean. This wasn't art. This wasn't religion. This was a signal. And the further researchers explored the cave, the more they found a system of markings unlike anything they'd seen. Curved lines, layered in triplets, wave-like spirals on the lowest walls, and a single stone burial, the skull crushed but facing upward, mouth filled with fine beach sand. So what were they trying to say? And more importantly, who were they saying it to? The cave burials of Chelyabinsk, Russia. Thousands of miles from the ocean, in a cave system near ancient glacial lakes, researchers discovered an early human burial site with a disturbing pattern. Every adult skeleton was placed face down, hands over ears, and in every child's mouth pebbles and sand. This isn't coincidence, it's ritual. One researcher theorized the burials weren't for the dead. They were warnings for the living. When the earth moans, do not listen. When the sky is calm, but the birds flee, run. Why the handprint? The hand was no ordinary symbol in prehistoric culture. In Lascaux, in Chauvet, in Sulawesi, handprints were claims, declarations, sometimes even signatures of survival. But here, the hand pointed away from safety, toward the very thing that destroyed them, almost like it was marking where the danger began. The symbol that keeps reappearing across multiple tsunami-prone coastlines, in caves, cliff faces, and even on buried tools, there's a recurring symbol, 3 arcs, stacked, parallel, sometimes with a single line beneath them. It's not a language. It's older than that. And while interpretations vary, most agree. It's the wave, a visual memory, a prehistoric version of a warning sign. One found deep in the Baton's Islands of the Philippines was scratched over and over, carved with such force, the stone beneath it cracked. Not decoration, not storytelling, desperation. And then, there's the sea burial. In the southern coast of Chile, in a region now swallowed by salt marsh, archaeologists found a burial mound that was strange. No bones, just tools. And inside the mound, a bowl filled with crushed coral and sand, and in the center, a single obsidian blade etched with a symbol of 3 crashing lines. One theory, it was a sacrifice, not to a god, but to the memory of the wave, an offering to keep it from returning, as if the ocean could be bargained with. But what's most terrifying is this. Many of these caves, the ones with wave symbols, with sandy graves, with pointing hands, they were sealed on purpose, with rocks, with rituals, with fire. Some had burned layers near the entrances like people tried to cleanse the site before abandoning it. Some had animal bones arranged in circles, as if guarding whatever was inside. This wasn't abandonment. This was containment, as if the memories were too dangerous to leave open. So what did cavemen do when there was a tsunami? They remembered it in stone. They buried it in ritual. And when the memory became too heavy, they hid it underground. Because even if the sea took everything the warning had to survive, the wave came. Everyone ran. Except them. The footprints in the sand show it clearly, dozens racing uphill in all directions. But one set walked the other way. Toward the shore, toward the roar, toward what they knew was coming. Archaeologists call these return paths, imprints left behind in now hardened sediment. But these aren't from foragers or forgotten travelers. They're different. Deep heel marks, suggesting slow, intentional steps. Trails that end abruptly, not turned, not scattered, but stopped. And in rare cases, objects left behind, carefully arranged. Shells, tools, bones, almost like an altar. Why? What would drive someone to walk into the end? The Silent Woman of AWA. In Japan's Kii Peninsula, researchers excavated the remains of a woman buried alone in a shallow grave, dated to shortly after a massive tsunami event around 3,000 years ago. She wasn't washed there. She was placed there, with her body wrapped in seaweed, her face painted with crushed shell powder, and her arms folded over a flat stone etched with tide markings. There were no other graves nearby, no signs of a village, just her. The locals called her the Tide Watcher. And the oral legends speak of women who could hear the sea's breath before it turned violent. Were these just stories? Or did some people have a different kind of role? Not to survive, but to stay and observe the witness stones. In coastal Peru, archaeologists found a series of small stone structures on bluffs facing the Pacific. Too small to live in. No fire pits, no food, just flat slabs facing the horizon. Inside, they found charcoal-crushed pigment, and in one, a human jawbone placed upright like a handle. One of the researchers described it like this: It's not a shelter. It's not a grave. It's a seat, a station, like someone waited here and wanted us to know it. The theory of the tellers. Some believe these people were ritual witnesses, early spiritual figures whose purpose wasn't escape, but understanding. To watch the wave, to feel the tremors, to memorize the sound of the world breaking and pass it on. We've seen it echoed in tribal legends. In the Solomon Islands, where one man stays behind to speak to the sea. In the Nicobar Islands, where elders carve title records into coconut shells and refuse to evacuate. No matter how many waves come, is it fatalism or is it something else? A belief that somebody has to remember from the inside. The last fire, one of the most chilling finds, comes from the coast of modern-day Morocco. In a small sea-facing cave, archaeologists discovered the remains of a single hearth, still blackened, still surrounded by tools, and in the center, a scorched animal skull, untouched for over 6,000 years. There were no walls, no beds, no water jugs, only that fire. One theory? The last person to stay behind built the fire to be seen, not by survivors, but by the wave. What did cavemen do when there was a tsunami? Some ran, some rebuilt, but a few, the strangest, the quietest, chose to watch. They became the memory of the flood, not in words, not in stories, but in footsteps, altars, bones, and flame. It was buried under centuries of sand. A wide stone ring on the edge of a cliff, half swallowed by the surf. Not a shelter, not a shrine. But when researchers stood inside it, something happened. They could hear the ocean, not just the crash of the waves, but a low, droning hum vibrating through the stone. And the longer they stood still, the clearer it became. The structure wasn't facing away from the sea, it was listening. The sea circles of Honshu. On Japan's remote western coast, archaeologists uncovered a series of prehistoric stone rings, each positioned facing the open water, with meticulous alignment to the tide and moon cycles. But what shocked them wasn't the precision, it was the acoustics. Inside each circle, sound changes. Waves become louder, crisper. Some frequencies even amplify, as if bouncing between the stones. And in the center of the largest circle, a smooth depression shaped like a bowl. Not for offerings, not for fire, for sound. One expert called it a prehistoric ear tuned to the ocean. But the question is, why? The first tsunami sensors? One theory gaining traction is this. These were early warning systems. Not through sight or writing, but sound. As waves swell, frequency changes, air pressure shifts. Cavities like these could pick up the subsonic rumble of a distant wave hours before it arrives. Today, we use deep-sea buoys. Back then, maybe they used stone bowls and echo walls. The ocean wall of Isla Blanca. Off the coast of Central America lies a barely visible curve of stone, stretching hundreds of meters, built to face the ocean, not stop it. There are no entry points, no defensive features, but inside, carvings of spirals, symbols of waves, and dozens of shell fragments arranged in deliberate concentric circles. One symbol repeats again and again. A circle with a single crack down the center, almost like an eye or an opening. It's not a barrier, it's a conduit, a way for the ocean's voice to reach inland. Why talk to the sea? Because when something takes everything from you, again and again, your food, your shelter, your children, you either run from it or you try to understand it. In one site in Papua New Guinea, elders speak of the singing rock stones that echo differently when the sea is angry. When asked what they mean, they say, The water sings louder when it's ready to rise. Sound, not vision. Vibration, not speech. Pre-language awareness. And here's where it gets strange. At one site, archaeologists recreated the echo patterns digitally and found that when the tide rose past a certain point, the chamber produced a low-frequency pulse, a sound only felt in the chest. A prehistoric warning siren. So what did cavemen do when there was a tsunami? They didn't just survive it, they tuned into it. They built with stone, sand, and silence structures that could hear before they saw, and echo before they understood. Not monuments, not temples. Instruments of fear, of memory, of survival. For tens of thousands of years, the ocean was the boundary between life and death. You could eat from it, travel along it, admire its beauty, but the moment you forgot its power, it reminded you, with no warning, no mercy. And for those who lived closest to it, that risk wasn't just a background fear, it was a constant generational pressure. The wave called the careless, erased the unprepared, and left behind only the ones who could anticipate the unthinkable. Evolution doesn't reward strength, it rewards adaptation. And what the tsunami demanded was mental. Planning, pattern recognition, cooperation. The ability to imagine something that hadn't happened yet and change your behavior before it did. That is not animal instinct. That is human foresight. Cognitive scientists have long debated when humans developed what's known as prospective reasoning, the ability to simulate future events in the mind. But new archaeological evidence suggests it may have evolved earlier than we thought, and not in the safety of inland forests, but in the shadow of a hostile coast. One study compared prehistoric coastal communities to inland foragers, looking at tool complexity, burial customs, and shelter designs. The result? Coastal groups developed modular architecture sooner, they adopted shared child-rearing spaces earlier, and their tools often show multi-purpose design, suggesting planning for multiple outcomes. That's not just cultural evolution, that's cognitive adaptation to catastrophe. Why is this important? Because to survive a tsunami, you don't just need to run, you need to know when to run, why, and where, all based on fragments of evidence. That means linking abstract cues. The birds are gone, the tide is wrong, the wind is too still. No animal survives like that, but humans do. Because humans can simulate, and the cost of failing to simulate? Death by water. This theory has been nicknamed the tsunami brain hypothesis. The idea that our species' unique cognitive leap came not from chasing mammoths or crafting art, but from learning to outthink a force that couldn't be fought. The wave couldn't be outrun by muscle. It couldn't be resisted by weapons. It couldn't be negotiated with. It could only be anticipated. And in learning to anticipate it, we developed POW, shared memory, strategic communication, and above all, time, consciousness, the ability to understand before, during, and after. That's not just survival. That's the foundation of storytelling, of history, of science. Some researchers now believe that the deep fear encoded in tsunami legends across every continent is not coincidence. It's not just myth. It's ancestral programming, passed down not through genes alone, but through warning stones, through bedtime stories, through cave symbols and ritual screams, memory made sacred. So what did cavemen do when there was a tsunami? They didn't just run. They didn't just survive. They changed, and in doing so, became more human, not in spite of the wave, but because of it. A century passes, then two. No more tremors, no more stories. Children born inland begin asking why the ocean is forbidden, why the cliffs are taboo, why their ancestors feared something that seems so peaceful now, and slowly they go back. This is the Forgotten Cycle. It wasn't just about survival, not even memory. It was about the deep, haunting need to reclaim what was lost. But the coast wasn't just revisited, it was ritualized. The pilgrimage paths of the Bay of Bengal archaeologists found thin, well-trodden trails cutting through dense jungle toward the coast, not used for trade, not wide enough for migration, but leading to one thing: stone platforms facing the sea. On them, artifacts placed in regular intervals, burned incense resins, shell necklaces, and, in one case, a child's carved toy boat, buried nose, first in the sand. None of these sites were ever inhabited. There were no homes, no tools, only offerings. Offerings not to celebrate the sea, but to keep it calm. Why keep going back? Because fear fades, but ritual preserves. Many believe these early visits were acts of controlled remembrance, not to rebuild, but to acknowledge the force that once tried to erase them. Imagine a parent bringing their child to a shoreline and saying, "This is where the water screamed." It's not science. It's not history. It's something deeper. A cultural pressure release valve designed to keep the warning alive without letting it poison the soul. The sand temples of Micronesia. Along coral atolls prone to flooding, early structures have been found with hollow bases filled with fine white sand. Above them, thin stone walls carved with spirals, fishhooks, and tidal markings. These were not homes. They had no roofs, no protection. But every generation, new sand was added. This was ritual sedimentation, a practice where coastal people buried the memory of the wave again and again, not to forget it, but to contain it, to say, "We remember what you did, but you don't own us anymore." And then, the rebuilding. In some regions, the return became permanent, and here's the eerie part. The new villages were often built exactly where the old ones were washed away, but with changes. Raised platforms, wider escape routes, homes that opened in multiple directions. Architecture as a survival strategy, but always with a center space, a silent place. Sometimes with markings, sometimes with sand, always with memory. We think of cavemen as moving forward, escaping disaster, learning from it. But sometimes, the most human act is to go back, to confront the sea again, to rebuild not out of ignorance, but out of the belief that this time, they might be ready. The story of the tsunami doesn't end when the wave recedes. It ends when the people choose to return. And they always did, because no matter how deadly the ocean is, it's also food, it's trade, it's beauty, it's power. It's where the sky touches the earth and where stories are always born. Some losses you can name: shelter, tools, crops, kin. But some losses, they're quieter, harder to trace, and yet more devastating. Because when the wave hit, it didn't just destroy homes, it destroyed knowledge. In a coastal cave system off the island of Timor, researchers uncovered evidence of one of the oldest weaving traditions on Earth. Tiny notched shells used as looms, pigment-stained spindles, fragments of fabric preserved in clay, and then nothing. A sudden absence, a missing layer, followed by newer inhabitants with no evidence of textile work at all. The skill was gone, not faded, gone. A pattern of cultural collapse. Tsunamis don't just kill, they disconnect. Elders swept away before they can pass on oral histories, ritual spaces buried under salt and time, languages erased when speakers vanish overnight. We often assume knowledge accumulates over time, but in the wake of a disaster, it can vanish in a single afternoon. Some of the earliest cave pigments were lost this way. So were tool-making sequences, entire songs, gone before they were ever recorded in memory. The Village with No Words in 2019. Researchers studying genetic markers in Papua New Guinea identified an inland community whose dialect contains dozens of loanwords from a coastal language, but no speakers of that language remain. No songs, no stories, only fragments in conversation like echoes. Where did the words come from? From a village that, as legend says, went quiet in a single sunrise. The tsunami didn't just erase their homes, it erased their voice. Cultural ghosts. There's a recurring motif carved into stone across many coastal regions, a figure with no mouth, found in the Andaman Islands, the eastern Philippines, the coast of Madagascar, and even isolated cliff faces in South America. A faceless person, or rather, a voiceless one, always standing at the edge of the water. Some call them the forgotten, others the ones who couldn't warn. But the meaning is clear. They're not watching the sea. They're what the sea took. Knowledge isn't inevitable. We like to think our ancestors slowly got smarter, generation by generation. But what if the tsunami reset everything? What if we had rituals more complex than we've imagined? Maps drawn in stone that no longer make sense. Calendars based on the moon and tide shattered mid-sequence. Myths that once explained the world broken in half. Each wave didn't just destroy villages, it destroyed civilizations in miniature. Pocket cultures, unrecorded genius, all gone. So, what did cavemen do when there was a tsunami? They rebuilt, they warned, they remembered, but they also grieved. Not just for their dead, but for the knowledge, the stories, the people they could have become had the sea not come roaring back. And that brings us to the end of this part of the story. If you've ever lost something intangible a moment, a memory, and almost you understand what this means, comment below with your thoughts. And subscribe if you haven't already. Because in the final part, we ask the question we've been circling since the beginning. Did the ocean create us, or did it shape us out of fear? Either way, we'll end this journey where it began. At the edge of the sea, where the sky breaks, where the ground shakes, and where a single drop can become a flood